In June of 1959, a small British team brought 3 open-top sports cars to Le Mans, and a plan that sounded insane. They were going to beat Ferrari, the most feared name in motorsport, with a car that was slower on paper. 24 hours later, 2 of those cars finished first and second. Weeks after that, the same team won the World Sportscar Championship outright. And then, at the very top, they walked away from the sport and never came back. This is the story of the Aston Martin DBR1, the car behind one of the greatest one-hit wins in racing history. We are counting down 10 things that make it extraordinary, and the most remarkable part of all is sitting at number 1. Number 10. Aston Martin never even meant to chase the championship. This is the part the legend usually gets backwards. Aston Martin did not arrive in 1959 with a grand plan to dethrone Ferrari across a whole season. The boss of the company, David Brown, had actually ruled against a full title campaign on cost grounds. It was simply too expensive, and the money was needed elsewhere. Brown was a tractor manufacturer who had bought Aston Martin after the war and put his own initials, D and B, onto the cars. He cared about racing, but he cared about it sensibly. The one race that truly mattered to him was the famous 24-hour race in France. That single event had been the holy grail for Aston Martin for decades, and the company had been turning up there since 1928 without ever scoring an outright win. Winning it outright was the only goal Brown genuinely cared about, and everything else was a luxury. The company had spent the whole decade slowly creeping toward it, race after race, getting a little closer each year without ever quite reaching the top step. So the season started small. The team only committed to the rounds that made sense, and the promise of appearance money helped talk them into a few more. What began as a focused run at one race slowly grew into something nobody had planned. The team would stumble into a world championship almost by accident, by simply doing well at the events they did show up to. Keep that in mind as this story unfolds, because everything that follows happened to a team that was not even trying to win the thing they ended up winning. Number 9. On paper, the DBR1 should have lost. The DBR1 was designed by Ted Cutting, the chief designer of Aston Martin's racing department, who shaped almost every part of the car himself. The chassis, the bodywork, and the engine were largely his work. It used a lightweight multi-tube frame, disc brakes all round, and a 3-litre straight 6 that produced somewhere around 250 horsepower. It was elegant, it was beautifully built, and it was clever. It had also already proven it could win, taking the brutal Nürburgring 1,000-kilometre race 3 years running. But against Ferrari on the long French circuit, it had one serious problem. It was not fast enough. The main rival was the Ferrari 250 Testarossa, and the Ferrari had a 12-cylinder engine that made noticeably more power. Straight-line speed there is everything, because the circuit has long, flat-out sections where horsepower decides who pulls away. During a test session earlier that year, the truth became impossible to ignore. Ferrari turned up and treated it like psychological warfare, sending their drivers out to smash the lap record and crush Aston Martin's confidence before the real race had even begun. Aston Martin, by contrast, sent 2 drivers simply to watch, measure, and learn. Then they went home and went to work. Through patient development, including small aerodynamic tweaks like a cover over the empty passenger side and panels fitted over the rear wheels, the team clawed back a useful chunk of top-end speed. It was never going to be enough to match the Ferraris outright, but it narrowed the gap just enough to make the rest of the plan possible. The message came back clear. The Ferraris were quicker, and there was no easy way to close the gap on raw pace. A normal team would have panicked. Aston Martin did something far smarter. If they could not beat Ferrari on speed, they would beat Ferrari on patience, and they would use the one weakness the Italian cars had been hiding all season. Number 8. The winning move was to send a sacrificial rabbit after Ferrari. The man with the plan was team boss John Wyer, and his idea has become one of the most famous strategies in racing history. Wire believed the Ferraris had a hidden flaw that year. They ran hot, and they were fragile when pushed hard for long stretches. So instead of telling all of his drivers to go slow and survive, he did the exact opposite with one of them. He turned Stirling Moss into bait. Moss was handed the fastest and most highly strung version of the car, fitted with an older engine that made more power at the direct cost of reliability. His job was not to win. His job was to sprint off the line, lead the race, and drive flat out to drag the Ferraris into chasing him. The hope was that the Italian cars, desperate not to lose to a British upstart, would push themselves so hard that their engines would cook and break. Moss was in effect a fox set loose to run the hounds into the ground until they dropped. Meanwhile, the other two DBR1s, including the car of Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby, were ordered to hang back and run slow. They were given lap times more than 10 seconds off the leading pace and told to nurse the machinery like it was made of glass. It was a brutal, cold-blooded gamble. One car was being thrown away on purpose so the other two could survive to the finish. Wire was not betting blindly though. He had studied the Ferraris all season long, and he was almost certain they could not hold a truly flat-out pace for a full day. He was wagering the entire result on a flaw he was confident his rivals had never fixed. And it worked almost exactly as Wire had drawn it up on paper. Number 7. The bait car did its job, then died right on schedule. When the flag dropped, Stirling Moss exploded off the line and tore straight into the lead. He was relishing the chance to drive hard instead of cruising, and he immediately began pulling the Ferraris along behind him. A famous report from the time summed it up as Moss against the Ferraris with a vengeance. The Ferrari of Jean Berra fought back, slipping past in the second hour, and the two of them traded the lead in a genuine duel at the front of the field. This was the trap quietly closing. Every single lap that Moss and the Ferraris ran at that blistering pace was a lap that punished those engines a little more. Moss clawed the lead back before handing his car over to his co-driver, but the strain was always going to come with a bill, and the plan was for the rabbit to pay it first. Sure enough, after roughly 6 hours of racing, the Moss car dropped a valve and its engine let go. To most of the people watching, it looked like a disaster. The Aston that had been leading the race was suddenly out. But inside the team, this was not a failure at all. This was the plan working perfectly. The bait had done its job and burned itself out exactly as expected, having forced the Ferraris to run themselves ragged for a quarter of the race. Now everyone in the pits simply waited to see whether the Italian cars would be made to pay the very same price. Number 6. The Ferraris broke down one by one, just as predicted. This is the moment the genius of the whole strategy revealed itself. The Ferraris had run flat out to keep up with Moss, and now the bill came due in full. The Berra car, which had done so much of that early leading, ground to a halt before the race even reached its halfway point. Another works Ferrari retired soon after. The mighty 12-cylinder machines that were faster on every single straight were dropping out one after another, undone by the very speed they had used to chase down a British sports car that was always going to break anyway. They were not the only ones falling apart. The Jaguars, another serious threat, had their own troubles and burned out of contention too. As the night wore on, the survivors were not the fastest cars, they were the smartest. That left one Ferrari still standing, and it was a serious one, leading the race comfortably in the hands of two of the finest drivers of the era. For hours that car looked like the certain winner. It was quicker than the surviving Astons and it had built up a healthy lead, but it was carrying the same flaw as its dead teammates, and it had been worked hard to hold the front. With about 4 hours left to run, that final Ferrari rolled to a stop with overheating and falling oil pressure. The exact weakness John Wyer had bet the entire race on had now wiped out every front-running Ferrari in the field. Number 5. The car finished in far better shape than the men driving it. Aston Martin had not so much beaten Ferrari as lured Ferrari into beating itself. While the Ferraris were tearing themselves apart, the surviving Aston of Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby was quietly climbing the order. They had started the strategy buried back in 8th place after the first hour, but by carefully managing the car, braking late and saving the engine, they rose to the lead after about 7 hours and never lost it. The cruel twist is that the car was punishing its drivers almost as badly as the race had punished the Ferraris. The DBR1 had a design quirk that turned the cockpit into an oven. The clutch pedal sat just above the exhaust, and the heat soaked straight up through the metal into the footwell. Salvadori ended the race with a foot that had been slowly roasted over 24 hours, and he was already fighting off a heavy cold on top of it. Carroll Shelby had it even worse. The future creator of the Shelby Cobra had a heart condition, and he raced that entire day with a nitroglycerin tablet tucked under his tongue to keep his chest pain at bay. And here is the part that makes it almost unbelievable. After all of that, after 24 hours of sustained abuse, the car itself was practically untouched. Salvadori later said the oil pressure read 80 pounds at the start and never varied once, and that the machine was completely healthy and could have run another full day without complaint. The men were wrecked. Salvadori was so unwell he did not even make it to the official podium presentation. The Aston, on the other hand, was flawless. If you have ever seen the opening night sequence of the film Ford against Ferrari, that scene is a direct nod to this very win, with Matt Damon playing a young Carroll Shelby. It is a fitting tribute because the real story is somehow even better than the movie version. Quick thing before we get to the top 4 on this list. The data on this channel shows that more than 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. That means you are showing up for the stories, but the algorithm has no reason to keep bringing them to you. If you have made it this far into the tale of the DBR1, you clearly care about how the greatest cars ever built earned their place in history. Hit subscribe so the next one actually reaches you. Now, back to a victory that nearly killed the men who drove it. Number 4, the win set records and ended in a perfect 1-2 finish. When Salvadori handed over to Shelby for the run to the flag, the result was no longer in any doubt. The number 5 DBR1 took the checkered flag first, and the sister car of Maurice Trintignant and Paul Frere came home second, just 1 lap behind. A Ferrari road-going model trailed far back in 3rd place, more than 20 laps down. It was a complete Aston Martin 1-2, the kind of result teams dream about and almost never actually get at an endurance race this cruel. What makes it even more incredible is that 1959 was the first time either Salvadori or Shelby had ever managed to finish the 24-hour race at all. They did not simply reach the end on their breakthrough run, they won the whole thing. The numbers behind the win were staggering for the era. The winning car covered 2,701 miles over the full 24 hours at an average speed of 112.5 miles per hour across 323 laps. That performance shattered every existing record for a 3-litre class car at the time. For a machine that had spent the entire race being deliberately driven below its limit to protect the engine, those figures were genuinely remarkable. And there is one detail that makes the whole thing even sweeter. This still stands as the only outright victory Aston Martin has ever scored at the Great French Endurance Classic. Not before and not since in more than 70 years of trying. The mark has returned many times in the modern era and won in lesser classes, but the top step of the podium, the overall win, has belonged to that single afternoon in 1959 and nothing else. Every time you hear someone call that race the hardest victory to win in all of motorsport, this is a big part of the reason why. Number 3. 2 months later they won a world title they were never meant to win. That single race was supposed to be the whole point. But that one victory suddenly put Aston Martin within striking distance of the entire World Sportscar Championship, and the accidental title run was now very real. The season came down to a final showdown at the Tourist Trophy at Goodwood in England, a 6-hour race that would settle a 3-way fight between Aston Martin, Ferrari and Porsche. Going into it, Ferrari actually led the points on 18, with Aston Martin second on 16 and Porsche just a single point further back. It was anyone's title to take. What followed was pure chaos. During a pit stop, the Aston of Stirling Moss caught fire when a fuel hose was opened too early and the spillage burst into flames. Fire tore through the pit area, and for a moment it looked like the whole team might be wiped out on the spot. A rival privateer was so alarmed he gave up his own pit, so the works squad had somewhere to keep working. With his own car burned and out of the running, Moss simply leapt into one of the other team cars and carried on, hunting down the leading Porsche with one of the great drives of his entire career. Behind him, the other works Astons held their station, and the team stormed to a clean 1-2-3 finish, several laps clear of the nearest challenger. Moss reeled the Porsche back in, retook the lead, and brought it home to win the race and the championship in one single stroke. With that, Aston Martin became the first British manufacturer ever to win the Sports Car World Championship. They had taken on both Ferrari and Porsche across a brutal 5-race season they had never planned to contest, and beaten the pair of them. A team that began the year refusing to chase the title finished it as champions of the world. Number 2. One of those 5 cars became the most expensive British car ever sold. Here is something nobody could possibly have imagined back in 1959. Only 5 DBR1s were ever built. 5. And decades later, that tiny handful of cars became some of the most valuable machines on the entire planet. In 2017, the very first DBR1 ever made rolled across the auction block at a sale in California. This was the car that Stirling Moss had driven to a stunning victory at the Nürburgring that same championship year, breaking the lap record over and over on his way to the win. When the bidding finally stopped after a fierce battle that ran on for nearly 7 minutes between 2 determined buyers, the hammer fell at $22.5 million. At that moment, it became the most expensive British car ever sold at auction, beating the record set only a year earlier by a Jaguar D-Type. The auction house called it the most important Aston Martin ever produced. For perspective, that figure put it among the most valuable cars of any nationality ever sold under the hammer, in a bracket normally reserved for the rarest Ferraris in existence. Think for a second about what that actually means. Aston Martin built 5 of these cars to go racing on a budget so tight the boss had argued against the very championship they ended up winning. A car from that program, hand-built by a small team in an English workshop, later sold for a sum that could buy a whole fleet of modern supercars and still leave change for a house. The thing that was almost never built at all turned out to be priceless. That is the kind of value that only comes from a story like this one, and the final part of that story is the most extraordinary detail of them all. Number 1. At the absolute peak, they quit and never came back. This is the part that makes the entire tale unforgettable. Aston Martin had just done the impossible. They were the winners of the greatest endurance race on the planet and the champions of the world, sitting right on top of the whole sport. Any normal company would have come straight back the following year to defend everything they had just built. Aston Martin did the complete opposite. They walked away from sports car racing altogether. It remains one of the boldest exits any team has ever made, leaving the stage while still completely undefeated at the very top. The reason was that David Brown had a different dream burning away in the background. He wanted Formula One glory, and he pulled the works team out of sports cars to throw everything at a new Grand Prix car called the DBR4. There was just one enormous problem. The DBR4 was already obsolete before it ever turned a wheel in anger. It was a front-engined car in an era when small, light, rear-engine machines were taking over the sport, and it was hopelessly outpaced. While Aston chased that fading dream, the rear-engined cars swept the championship, with Jack Brabham and Cooper taking the crown. The Grand Prix project quietly failed, and within a couple of seasons, Aston Martin abandoned Formula One too. So the 4 surviving factory cars were simply sold off to private owners, and the curtain came down on the works team that had just conquered the world. A couple of them raced on in private hands for a while, one even winning a sports car race in France the following year. But by 1962, every last DBR1 had been retired from competition for good. From there, they drifted into museums and private collections, where they quietly turned into legends. There was no title defense. There was no encore. They reached the summit of sports car racing, planted their flag and left, chasing a different prize they would never actually catch. And to this day, more than 70 years later, that single afternoon in June of 1959 remains the only time Aston Martin has ever won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright. They beat Ferrari at the cruelest race in the world, won a championship they never set out to chase, and then vanished from the mountain they had just climbed. Almost nobody in racing has ever gone out quite like that. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, and we will keep telling the stories behind the greatest cars ever built. We will see you in the next one.